What if the very emotion you assume is driving progressive change, like the feeling of guilt, is actually the biggest roadblock to achieving it?
Right. Imagine for a second that feeling bad about a societal problem doesn't actually lead to fixing the problem.
Exactly. It just, motivates people to find the fastest, cheapest way to stop feeling bad.
And that is a fundamental tension in sociology right now. I mean, we often operate under the assumption that if people just realize there's an inequality and feel remorseful about it, structural change will naturally follow.
But the data we are looking at today suggests the exact opposite is happening.
It really does.
So welcome to today's custom-tailored deep dive. We have a massive and, quite frankly, very heavy stack of sources in front of us today.
Yeah, a lot of sociological research,
Mhm.
quantitative psychological data, and some highly debated policy frameworks.
Right, and the overarching topic here is reparations and other remedies, frameworks for systemic racial equity.
It is a really dense stack, ranging from individual cognitive psychology all the way up to, like, trillion-dollar macroeconomic proposals.
It's huge. We're really looking at the underlying architecture of how researchers and sociologists are currently thinking about racial equity.
Yeah, the literal nuts and bolts of it.
Now, before we start pulling the engine out of this car to see how it works, I want to set some really firm ground rules for you, the listener.
Very necessary here.
Because, the source material we're covering today contains highly politically charged content. Our mission on this deep dive is strictly an impartial, objective exploration.
Right, we are not here to take a political side.
Exactly. We're not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we trying to validate the feasibility of these specific policies. Our only goal is to unpack the mechanics of the arguments presented in the literature.
We just want you to fully understand the academic conversation taking place, regardless of where you might personally stand on the political spectrum.
Exactly. That is a crucial baseline.
Yeah, we're basically treating these frameworks like blueprints. We're going to examine the stress points, look at the foundations, and explain how the authors of these papers believe the structure is supposed to hold up.
So let's jump back to that surprising insight about guilt, because it completely flips the script on how most people view anti-racism.
It really does.
The sources argue that traditional, individual-focused anti-racism is hitting a massive wall, and that wall is built almost entirely out of how humans process the emotion of white guilt.
Right.
Let's unpack the mechanics of this. The literature refers to this guilt as a developmental stepping stone, but one that is highly volatile. So how does the research actually define what's happening in someone's head here?
Well, the sources map out a trajectory. When someone from a dominant group moves from a state of, like, racial obliviousness into a state of structural awareness.
Meaning they suddenly recognize that the playing field isn't level.
Exactly. That realization often triggers guilt. But the researchers characterize this specific guilt as an intensely self-focused emotion.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so the primary motivation it creates isn't necessarily to dismantle a hierarchy. The primary motivation is to relieve the internal psychological discomfort of feeling bad.
I see. So the brain treats the guilt as a threat, and the immediate goal is just to neutralize the threat. It's treating a symptom of the mind, not the disease in the society.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. And the quantitative social psychologists in your sources actually mapped this out statistically.
Wait, really? How do you map that?
They use a technique called structural equation modeling. You can think of it as tracking the literal pathway of human motivation.
Okay, I want to understand how they measured this. Walk us through that pathway. How do you map an emotion into a statistic?
Okay, so they set up an equation with 3 distinct variables to see what actually predicts support for policy changes. Variable X is privilege awareness.
Just simply recognizing that unearned advantages exist.
Right. Then variable M is the emotional mediator, which in this case is guilt. And variable Y is policy support.
Okay, X, M, and Y.
Now, the logical assumption most people make is that X leads directly to Y. If you know about the problem, you will support fixing it.
But I'm guessing the data shows a detour.
A major detour.
Yeah.
The statistical modeling confirms that just recognizing you have an unearned advantage variable X does not directly translate to variable Y.
Wow.
Yeah. The cognitive recognition has to be converted into a very specific collective emotional discomfort guilt to actually mobilize support for any social policies.
Okay, so you need the guilt to get the support.
But here is the fascinating catch, and this is where the roadblock appears. This guilt robustly predicts support for compensatory policies. Think like direct financial payouts or targeted funding.
Okay.
But it completely fails to predict support for non-compensatory policies.
Meaning policies that just seek to increase equal opportunity or, general structural access. The data says guilt doesn't move the needle on those at all.
Not even an inch.
That's wild.
If the proposed policy doesn't offer a direct visible act of compensation that psychologically relieves the immediate feeling of guilt, the motivation to support it simply vanishes.
Wow. So bringing this down to a day-to-day level, this explains why the sources spend so much time analyzing consumer behavior.
Exactly.
Because if guilt just demands a quick, visible release valve, it becomes incredibly easy to commercialize.
Oh, absolutely.
The literature talks about this manifesting in what they call micro-reparative acts.
Yes, the illusion of action. The empirical consumer research in your stack shows that individuals often satisfy this systemic guilt through highly individualized transactional behaviors.
Like deciding to buy a slightly more expensive candle from a Black-owned business on an online platform.
Right.
Or choosing a service provider specifically because of a racial label. The transaction itself isn't really about the business. It's a purchase of moral absolution.
Spot on.
The consumer buys the candle, their moral self-perception increases, the guilt is relieved, and they just move on.
And while that transaction might benefit one specific business owner, the literature points out that it leaves the material, economic foundations of the broader racial hierarchy completely untouched.
It's a micro-action trying to solve a macro problem.
Yes.
It makes me think of treating a systemic software bug by just changing your desktop wallpaper.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. Sure, it makes the user feel a lot better visually, the screen looks completely different and feels fresh, but underneath, it leaves the actual coded hierarchy completely untouched.
Yeah.
The bug is still there, running in the background, dictating how the whole computer operates.
That is a phenomenal analogy because it highlights the limits of individualistic action. Changing the wallpaper doesn't rewrite the code.
Exactly.
And because that individualistic approach is failing to fix the underlying code, the sources argue that organizations, specifically educational institutions, need a fundamental, massive shift in how they approach equity training.
Which brings us directly into the classroom and the workplace. The research strongly advises moving entirely away from traditional privilege checking exercises.
Yes, you do.
And I want to dig into the why here, because privilege checking has been the standard corporate and academic training model for years now.
It has been the standard, but the sources argue it is failing because it relies on that same faulty mechanism.
Individual guilt.
Exactly. Yeah. Privilege checking often creates a moral binary in the room. It forces people to examine their personal advantages, which almost universally encourages defensive withdrawal.
Makes sense.
People get defensive, they deny the premise, or worse, they just engage in performative guilt confessions.
Basically just saying whatever they think the room wants to hear so they can stop feeling uncomfortable and get out of the seminar.
Precisely. It doesn't build a coalition, it just creates friction. So, scholars in your stack are advocating for a total shift to something called complicity pedagogy.
Complicity pedagogy.
Yeah, and the foundational text they use for this is Iris Marion Young's social connection model of responsibility.
Okay, let me challenge this concept because I'm looking at the terminology here.
Go for it.
If telling someone they have privilege makes them put their walls up, how does telling someone they are complicit in a racial hierarchy somehow bypass that defensiveness?
It's a fair point.
To the average listener, being called complicit sounds significantly harsher. It sounds like being called an accessory to a crime. How does that word lead to better collective responsibility?
That is a very natural reaction, and it's actually the first question most sociologists ask when encountering Young's model.
Right.
The key difference in complicity pedagogy isn't about escalating the blame. It's about shifting the focus entirely away from individual intent and placing it onto institutional design.
So it's removing the personal moral indictment from the equation.
Exactly. Privilege checking often feels like a judgment of your soul, like, are you a good person or a bad person based on your advantages? Complicity pedagogy, on the other hand, emphasizes a structural reality. All individuals within an institution are positioned within a racialized hierarchy, regardless of their personal intention.
Right. The structure.
You could be the most egalitarian, well-intentioned person on earth. But if you were operating within a system that was historically designed to produce unequal outcomes, You're complicit in those outcomes simply by participating in the system.
I see. So it actually lowers the heat of personal moral judgment.
It does.
It's essentially saying to a room full of people, look, none of you built this flawed machine, but we are all operating it together. Your intentions don't matter as much as the outputs of the machine. So how do we collectively redesign it?
You've hit the nail on the head. It prioritizes a collective responsibility for structural audits over subjective moral alignment.
That makes a lot of sense.
It completely bypasses the need for the individual to prove they are a good person and redirects that energy into taking responsibility for the design of the institution itself.
Which is a perfect pivot into the corporate sphere. Because if you theoretically graduate a cohort of students who understand this idea of systemic design, what happens when they enter a corporate workforce that is still entirely obsessed with individual guilt and PR statements?
Oh, that's where things get really tense.
Yeah, the sources take a remarkably harsh look at the modern boardroom, specifically tearing apart the standard corporate diversity statement.
The critique is blistering. The sources argue that corporations and academic institutions must immediately halt the practice of issuing symbolic, non-performative diversity declarations.
The text calls them a speech act. It's substituting the act of speaking for the act of changing.
Yes, and it ties right back to that psychological relief valve we discussed with the consumer behavior.
Oh, right.
Releasing a public statement relieves the corporate anxiety. It changes the desktop wallpaper.
The company gets the moral absolution without altering the corporate structure.
Exactly. To counter this, the policy frameworks in your sources demand a shift away from statements and toward a binding diversity accountability index.
Let's really unpack the mechanics of this index, because this isn't just a suggestion box in the break room. The text lays out mandatory, legally bound structural requirements.
It really does.
What does this actually look like in practice for a corporation?
It looks like rigid, non-negotiable compliance. First, it requires direct capital allocation percentages for minoritized contractors.
Okay.
This isn't a vague promise to, try to diversify our supply chain. This is a hard, legally binding percentage of the company's capital that must be allocated to these businesses.
So that forces a change in the material flow of money, regardless of how the executives feel about it.
Exactly.
What else is in the index?
Second, binding timelines for executive and board diversification. Again, hard deadlines, not aspirational goals.
Right.
Third, rigorous independent annual audits of hiring, promotion, and salary disparities. And crucially, the entire framework is backed by automatic severe financial penalties for noncompliance.
Looking at this list, are these frameworks essentially taking a deeply moral, emotional, and social issue and cold-bloodedly turning it into a strict financial compliance model?
Pretty much.
Because this sounds exactly like an SEC audit. It feels like they are intentionally stripping the human emotion completely out of the equation.
That is exactly what they are doing, and if you think back to the structural equation model we discussed, the reason why becomes clear.
Variable M guilt.
Yes. The sociologists realize that emotion is incredibly volatile.
Mm-hmm.
It peaks after a news event. It wanes when people get distracted. It gets fatigued.
Right.
By turning equity into a strict financial compliance model, you remove the reliance on the volatile emotion of the dominant group.
An SEC audit doesn't care if the CEO feels guilty or if they've checked their privilege.
Nope. It only cares if the spreadsheets match the legal requirement.
That is a fascinating workaround for the limits of human psychology. But it's one thing to force an audit on a Fortune 500 company. It is an entirely different universe to try and apply these mechanics to an entire nation.
It really is a massive jump.
And that is exactly what the sources do next. We move from corporate compliance to the trillion-dollar question national macro reparations.
Right. This is where the literature introduces scholar Joe Fagan's argument for massive collective reparations.
Okay.
The text argues that to address the historical structural injustices of slavery, legal segregation, and contemporary racism, the United States requires a structural intervention on a scale most people can't even fathom.
Let's talk about that scale, because the mechanics here are staggering.
Sure.
The funding required isn't discussed in the billions. It is estimated in the trillions of dollars.
Trillions. To give you, the listener, a sense of proportion, the text specifically compares the required federal financial commitment to the scale of national defense spending.
Wow. And let me just play devil's advocate here, maintaining our impartial lens. That is a massive, almost unimaginable conceptual leap for the average voter to make.
Absolutely.
To view reparations not as a one-time line-item budget expense, but as a perpetual core function of the state, literally on par with funding the military.
Yeah, it's a huge shift in perspective.
In a highly polarized political climate, how do the frameworks justify that kind of scale?
The justification provided by Fagan and others is based on longevity.
Hmm.
Racial oppression in the U.S., legally and structurally, has endured for roughly 15 generations.
15 generations.
Right. Therefore, the researchers argue the remedy simply cannot be a quick fix or a one-time payout. To undo 15 generations of structural extraction, it requires a multi-generational structural commitment.
That makes the structure of these reparations really interesting, too, because the focus here is heavily on the collective over the individual.
Very much so.
The sources note that while individual per capita payouts, like a check in the mail, are possible and discussed, the primary policy focus in this framework is on restoring entire communities to wholeness.
Exactly. The blueprint focuses on large-scale job training infrastructure, massive public housing programs, and massive seed capital funds for small businesses in marginalized areas.
So, to help you visualize this, we aren't talking about a legal settlement. The sources are describing something much closer to a domestic, multi-generational Marshall Plan.
Marshall Plan is a great comparison.
It is the complete structural reconstruction of an economy.
Structural reconstruction captures it perfectly, and it's not strictly monetary.
Oh, right.
The frameworks also demand sweeping legislative reforms, guaranteeing voting rights and representative participation. Plus, they call for aggressive, standardized education of the white public regarding American racial history.
The text actually calls that aggressive education the crucial first step for any long-term reparations strategy to even survive politically.
Yeah, without it, the political will just isn't there.
But I want to bring this multi-trillion-dollar national scale back down to your local reality for a minute, because the sources explore what is actually required of dominant groups to make these frameworks function at a neighborhood level.
And it is an incredibly tough pill to swallow.
It really is. It's the requirement of accepting actual, tangible, material loss.
This is where the theoretical framework meets the pavement of daily life. The literature is very clear that true structural equity requires dominant groups to accept material loss in the areas they traditionally protect the most fiercely.
We're talking about actionable structural policies that hit close to home.
Very close.
Things like zoning reforms that forcefully introduce affordable housing into wealthy, deeply segregated neighborhoods, fundamentally changing property values and neighborhood demographics.
Or sweeping school district desegregation policies.
Right.
The text explicitly notes that these must happen even when, and perhaps especially when, they cost dominant group children their localized competitive advantages in resources and college admissions.
Add to that progressive tax reforms designed specifically to extract and equalize resources in historically redlined communities.
Yeah.
The framework is essentially asking people to willingly vote to give up their own structural advantages.
Which brings us crashing right back into the psychological challenge we started with. To support these hard, materially costly policies, the literature states society must completely move past paternalistic charity.
Right.
They have to abandon what the text calls white saviorism, where people just engage in light charity work to resolve their personal guilt.
Right, they argue society needs to foster authentic, systems-level compassion.
Yes. And operationally, that means eliminating the fundamental attribution error.
For those who haven't taken Psych 101 in a while, the fundamental attribution error is the psychological tendency to blame marginalized people for systemic issues.
Right.
Like looking at someone in poverty and assuming they just didn't work hard enough, completely ignoring the structural barriers, the underfunded schools, or the discriminatory hiring practices they face.
Exactly. Fostering systems-level compassion requires shifting the societal focus entirely away from individual bad actors or perceived personal failings and placing the focus squarely on the systemic factors.
That's a big shift.
It is. And crucially, the framework demands ensuring that communities of color are the ones who center and define the policy actions. The dominant group cannot dictate the terms.
Otherwise, it places the emotional labor of education and policy design right back onto the minoritized individuals.
Exactly.
Okay, but this brings me to a highly critical question, and it ties this entire deep dive together.
Let's hear it.
Let's look at the gap between the beginning of our deep dive and where we are now. We looked at the statistical models in section 1.
Right, the X, M, and Y.
The structural equation modeling clearly showed that people currently only support equity policies when driven by the volatile psychological discomfort of guilt.
Yes.
And even then, that guilt only predicts support for easy compensatory
Only the
policies.
compensatory ones, yeah.
So if that is the proven baseline of human psychology, is it realistically possible to suddenly foster this deep, authentic, systems-level compassion that makes people willingly vote for their own material loss?
It's a huge ask.
It feels like the frameworks are demanding a level of psychological evolution that the data says doesn't exist yet.
You have just articulated the ultimate paradox at the heart of all these frameworks.
Really?
Yeah, the sociologists and psychologists in your sources have brilliantly mapped out a structural destination, binding corporate indexes, complicity pedagogy, multi-trillion-dollar macro reparations.
But
But the psychological vehicle we currently rely on to drive us there, which is guilt, keeps running out of gas before we even leave the driveway.
it's like we have the flawless blueprints for a multi-generational Marshall Plan, but when we look in the toolbox to start building it, all we have is a roll of duct tape.
What's fascinating is that the academic literature implicitly acknowledges this massive gap.
Oh, they do.
It's exactly why there is such a heavy, almost authoritarian emphasis on structural compliance over emotional persuasion in the corporate and educational sphere.
Oh, I see.
The logic is, if you can't rely on human compassion to sustain the effort over 15 generations, you have to build a cold, mechanical system of audits, mandates, and penalties that simply doesn't require compassion to function.
You essentially force the material change through rigid policy, crossing your fingers and hoping that societal psychology eventually catches up a few generations down the line.
That's the gamble.
So, to summarize this incredibly intense journey through the sources for you today, we started by diagnosing the psychological limits of white guilt.
Right.
We explored how it operates as a self-focused threat response that easily devolves into consumer micro-reparations, buying a candle for moral absolution while leaving the systemic code untouched.
From there, we explored the institutional shifts proposed to bypass that ineffective guilt. We looked at the mechanics of moving from privilege checking, which breeds defensiveness, to complicity pedagogy in education.
Where the focus shifts entirely to institutional design rather than personal moral failing.
Exactly.
Then we hit the corporate boardroom, examining how the frameworks demand stripping away human emotion entirely, replacing the performative PR speech acts with binding diversity accountability indexes.
Hard metrics, capital allocations, independent audits, and financial penalties, treating equity like an SEC audit.
And finally, we scaled all of those mechanics up to the trillion-dollar multi-generational national reparations framework. We confronted the ultimate hurdle, the demand for actual structural material loss from dominant groups in their schools, their neighborhoods, and their tax brackets.
It's a massive structural overhaul.
It really is. While these frameworks are vast, conceptually staggering, and undoubtedly controversial in the public sphere, understanding their architecture provides you with a crucial map of the current academic and policy discourse.
Yeah, it shows you exactly how researchers are trying to engineer a bridge across the massive, glaring gap between individual emotion and systemic equity.
And I think that leaves us with a critical, almost philosophical question to consider.
Yes, if the hard data proves that an emotion like guilt has a very strict ceiling on the types of policy it can mobilize, and we acknowledge that authentic compassion is incredibly difficult to sustain across an entire society.
What entirely different cognitive or emotional driver might humanity need to invent or discover to actually sustain a 15-generation commitment to structural equity?
That is a profound question to walk away with.
It really is something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.